Tony had always been a successful businessman. However, things took a turn for the worse when he lost his job. As he and Betty struggled to make ends meet, Tony began to feel the pressure of providing for his family. One day, Tony received a call from a recruiter offering him a job at a new company. Excited about the opportunity, he immediately accepted. Over the next few weeks, Tony worked hard to impress his new boss, Angela. As Tony spent more time with Angela, he found himself drawn to her. He began to share more about his personal life with her, including his financial struggles. Angela listened sympathetically and offered to help him in any way she could. One day, after work, Tony and Angela went out for drinks to celebrate a successful project they had completed. As the night wore on, the conversation became more intimate, and before long, Tony found himself lusting after Angela. Regaining her composure, Angela looked at Tony with concern. "What are we doing?" she asked. "I don't know," Tony replied, feeling both exhilarated and guilty at the same time. Despite his initial reservations, Tony continued to see Angela, secretly carrying on an affair with her behind Betty's back. As their relationship deepened, Tony became more and more consumed by his feelings for Angela, blurring the lines between his personal and professional life. "I can't stop thinking about you," Tony whispered to Angela as they stood in the company parking lot after work one evening. "I know," Angela replied, her voice soft and understanding. "But we have to be careful. We can't let anyone find out about us." "I know," Tony said, his heart racing. "But I can't help how I feel." As their affair continued, Tony found himself becoming more and more reckless. He would sneak out of the house at night to meet Angela, lying to Betty about where he was going. One night, after Tony had been particularly distant, Betty confronted him. "What's going on with you?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "You've been so distant lately." "It's nothing," Tony lied. "Just work stuff." But Betty knew that something was off. She could sense that Tony was hiding something from her, and it made her feel uneasy. Meanwhile, Tony and Angela continued to see each other, despite the risks. As their relationship became more and more intense, they began to lose sight of the consequences of their actions. Little did they know that their affair would soon have tragic consequences, changing their lives and the lives of those around them forever. Tony's affair with Angela was becoming more dangerous and complicated by the day. He was risking his job, his marriage, and his reputation to be with her. But the thrill of the affair was too intoxicating to give up. One day, as Tony and Angela were leaving the office, they were caught by one of their colleagues who had stayed late to finish some work. "Tony, Angela, what are you guys still doing here?" the colleague asked, giving them a curious look. "We were just finishing up some work," Tony lied, trying to maintain his composure. "I see," the colleague said, a sly smile crossing their face. "Well, have a good night." Tony breathed a sigh of relief as the colleague walked away, but he knew that they had narrowly escaped being caught. As the weeks went on, Tony became increasingly distant from Betty, leaving her feeling neglected and unloved. "Tony, why won't you talk to me?" Betty asked one evening. "Is there something going on?" "No, of course not," Tony replied, his tone defensive. "I'm just tired from work, that's all." But Betty could tell that something was off. She knew that Tony was lying to her, but she didn't know how to confront him about it. Meanwhile, Angela was becoming increasingly possessive of Tony. She would call and text him at all hours of the day and night, demanding his attention and affection. "Tony, why haven't you been answering my calls?" Angela asked one night, her voice tinged with anger. "Are you with Betty right now?" "No, of course not," Tony replied, trying to placate her. "I'm just busy with work." But Angela wasn't satisfied with his answer. She knew that something was going on, and she was determined to find out what it was. Little did Tony and Angela know that their affair was about to have devastating consequences, putting their lives in danger and leaving those around them reeling from the fallout. Betty had a gut feeling that something was going on between Tony and his boss, Angela. One day, while Tony was in the shower, Betty couldn't resist the urge to look through his phone. She found messages between Tony and Angela that confirmed her suspicions. The messages were full of love and affection, and Betty felt sick to her stomach as she read them. She waited for Tony to come out of the shower, her heart racing as she tried to compose herself. When Tony emerged from the bathroom, Betty couldn't keep it in any longer. "Who is Angela? And why are you exchanging love messages with her?" Betty demanded. Tony's face fell, and he tried to explain himself. "Betty, it's not what you think. Angela and we have a connection. But it doesn't mean I don't love you." Betty was beside herself with anger and hurt. "How could you do this to me? To our family? You've broken my trust, Tony." "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said, tears streaming down her face. Tony begged for forgiveness, but Betty was too hurt to give it right away. She needed time to process what had happened and decide what was best for herself and her family. Betty struggled with her emotions in the days following her discovery of Tony's affair. On the one hand, she was filled with rage and hurt that her husband had betrayed her in such a way. On the other hand, she still loved Tony and hoped they could salvage their marriage. After much soul-searching, Betty decided to forgive Tony. She sat him down and explained that while she was hurt, she still loved him and wanted to work through their problems. "I don't know if I can ever fully trust you again, Tony," she said, "but I want to try. I want us to get past this and rebuild our marriage." Tony was overjoyed to hear that Betty was willing to give him another chance. "I promise you, Betty, I will do whatever it takes to regain your trust," he said. For a while, things seemed to be improving between them, and they even went on a romantic weekend getaway to try to reconnect. But as time went on, Betty couldn't shake the feeling that Tony was still keeping secrets from her. He was working longer hours and spending more time away from home, and she couldn't help but wonder if he was seeing Angela again. Despite her fears, Betty tried to give Tony the benefit of the doubt. She didn't want to push him away by being overly suspicious, but deep down, she knew that their problems were far from over. Tony tried his best to keep his affair with Angela a secret from Betty, but he couldn't help but continue seeing her. He was addicted to the thrill of their illicit relationship, and he found himself constantly drawn back to her. Tony and Angela began to meet in secret, arranging their rendezvous at hotels and other discreet locations. Tony knew that he was risking everything: his marriage, his family, and even his job, but he couldn't seem to stop himself. As the weeks went on, Tony became increasingly distant from Betty. He was preoccupied with thoughts of Angela, and he often snapped at Betty when she tried to talk to him. Betty became increasingly suspicious of Tony's behavior, and she began to keep a closer eye on him. She noticed that he was working later and later hours, and that he was often unreachable for long periods of time. One day, Betty decided to snoop through Tony's phone. She felt guilty for invading his privacy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on. As she scrolled through his messages, her heart sank when she came across a series of texts from Angela. Betty's hands shook as she read through the messages, which were filled with declarations of love and plans for secret rendezvous. She felt like her world was collapsing around her. When Tony came home that night, Betty confronted him about his affair with Angela. "How could you do this to us, Tony?" she cried. "I thought we were working through things. I thought we were starting to rebuild our marriage." Tony hung his head in shame. "I'm so sorry, Betty," he said. "I don't know what's wrong with me. I love you, but I just couldn't resist Angela. Please forgive me." Betty was torn between her love for Tony and her anger at his betrayal. In the end, she decided to forgive him, hoping that they could move past his infidelity and salvage their marriage. But little did she know that Tony's affair with Angela would lead them down a dangerous and deadly path. It was a cool evening when Mr. Bright returned from work, tired and ready to unwind. As he approached his bedroom, he heard strange noises coming from inside. His heart raced as he pushed the door open to find his wife, Angela, in bed with Tony, her new employee. Mr. Bright was consumed with jealousy and rage. "What the hell is going on here?" he yelled, his voice shaking with anger. Mr. Bright was consumed with jealousy and rage. "What the hell is going on here?" he yelled, his voice shaking with anger. Tony quickly jumped out of bed, trying to explain himself, but Mr. Bright wasn't interested in hearing excuses. "I trusted you, Tony. And this is how you repay me? By sleeping with my wife?" Angela, on the other hand, was unapologetic. "It's not his fault. I wanted him. I love him," she said, her voice filled with defiance. Mr. Bright was stunned. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You love him? After everything we've been through together?" he said, his voice breaking. He stormed out of the room, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. "What are we going to do?" Angela asked, panic in her voice. "He's going to tell everyone about us." "I don't know," Tony replied, feeling guilty and ashamed. "I never wanted it to come to this. I never meant to hurt anyone." Angela rolled her eyes. "Save it, Tony. You knew what you were doing. And now we're all in deep trouble." They stood in silence for a moment, both lost in thought. Tony couldn't bear the guilt he was feeling. He knew he had made a terrible mistake and he needed to make it right. "I have to talk to him," Tony said finally. "I have to tell him how sorry I am and try to make things right." Angela scoffed. "And what do you expect him to do? Forgive you? He's not that kind of person, Tony. You've ruined everything." But Tony was determined. He couldn't live with the guilt of what he had done. He had to try to make it right, no matter the cost. The next morning, Mr. Bright confronted Angela about her affair with Tony. "I can't believe you would do this to me," he said, his voice shaking with anger and hurt. "How could you cheat on me with one of your employees?" Angela remained defiant, refusing to end the affair. "I can't help how I feel," she said, her voice cold and distant. "I'm sorry, but I won't end things with Tony." Mr. Bright felt a surge of rage building inside him. He couldn't believe that his wife would betray him like this, and he was determined to take matters into his own hands. He began plotting his revenge, carefully considering his options. He thought about confronting Tony, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. He thought about leaving Angela and starting a new life, but he couldn't bear the thought of her being happy without him. Angela and Tony's affair continued even after Mr. Bright caught them in bed together. They started meeting in secret, often in hotels across town, to avoid getting caught again. One day, while checking in at a hotel, Tony and Angela found themselves in a heated argument. "I can't keep doing this, Angela. We have to stop," Tony said, frustration evident in his voice. Angela rolled her eyes, clearly irritated. "What are you talking about? We can't just stop now. I love you, Tony." Tony sighed, shaking his head. "I know you do, but this is wrong. We're putting our jobs and our families at risk. We can't keep doing this." "So, what? You're just going to give up on us? You're going to let your boring, old life with Betty hold you back?" Tony gritted his teeth, anger rising inside of him. "Don't you dare talk about my wife like that. And this isn't about my life with Betty. It's about us, and what we're doing is wrong." Angela scoffed. "Fine. If you want to end it, then go ahead. But don't come crying to me when you're bored and lonely." With that, Angela stormed out of the hotel room, leaving Tony alone with his thoughts. He knew he had to end things with Angela, but the thought of losing her was tearing him apart inside. On a Saturday morning, Tony sat alone in his apartment, lost in his thoughts. He knew he had made a mistake by getting involved with Angela, but he couldn't shake the feeling of attraction and desire he had for her. As he sat there, he thought about his wife, Betty, and the pain he had caused her. He knew he needed to stay away from Angela, for the sake of his marriage and his family. But every time he thought about her, he felt his heart race and his palms sweat. He tried to distract himself with work and other activities, but the memory of Angela lingered in his mind. Finally, he made the decision to stay away from her, no matter how hard it may be. He knew he had to focus on repairing his relationship with Betty and regaining her trust. With a heavy heart, he deleted Angela's number from his phone and vowed to never speak to her again. It was a difficult choice, but one he knew was necessary for the sake of his marriage and his own well-being. Few minutes after he deleted her number, Tony's phone rang, and he hesitated before answering. It was Angela. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't stay away from her. "Hey, Tony. What's up?" Angela's voice came through the phone. "Hey, I was just thinking about you," Tony said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I've been thinking about you too," Angela replied. "I want to see you," Tony said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I want to see you too, Tony," Angela said, her voice filled with longing. "Can we meet at our usual hotel?" Tony asked. "Of course. I'll be there in an hour," Angela said before hanging up. Tony's heart raced with excitement and guilt as he rushed to get ready. He knew he shouldn't be doing this, but he couldn't help himself. As Tony and Angela met in the hotel room, he couldn't help but feel guilty for what he was about to do. He knew he shouldn't be here with Angela, but the soul tie between them was too strong to resist. Angela sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on Tony as he approached her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Angela smiled. "It's okay, Tony. We both know we can't stay away from each other." Tony shook his head. "I can't keep doing this to Betty. She doesn't deserve it." Angela rolled her eyes. "Betty doesn't have to know. We can keep this our little secret." Tony hesitated for a moment, but the temptation was too great. As they lay there in each other's arms, Tony couldn't help but feel like he was living a double life. He loved Betty and their family, but he couldn't seem to break free from the hold that Angela had on him. As Angela and Tony lay in bed, lost in their own world, they heard a sudden knock on the door. In the doorway stood Mr. Bright, his face twisted in anger as he pointed a gun at them. "How could you do this to me?" he yelled, his finger tightening around the trigger. Angela and Tony tried to plead with him, but their words fell on deaf ears. Mr. Bright was consumed with rage, and he was determined to make them pay for their betrayal. Without warning, he pulled the trigger, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the room. Angela and Tony both fell to the ground, their bodies lifeless. Mr. Bright stood there for a moment, staring at the scene before him, before turning around and leaving the room. The only sound that remained was the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hallway. Some days later, Mr. Bright was arrested and put in prison for the murder of Angela and Tony. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The once successful and respected businessman was now a prisoner, confined to a small cell with nothing but his regrets and guilt. Staring at the blank walls, he couldn't help but think about the events that led to his downfall. "How could I have been so blind?" he whispered to himself. "I ruined everything because of my jealousy and anger." Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, but no one came to visit him. His former friends and colleagues had abandoned him, and his family had disowned him. He was alone with his thoughts and his regrets. "I guess nobody wants to associate with a murderer," he said to himself bitterly. Despite his remorse, Mr. Bright knew he had to face the consequences of his actions. He spent his days in prison, reflecting on his mistakes and trying to make amends. But no matter how hard he tried, he knew he could never bring back the lives he had taken. "I deserve to be here," he thought to himself. "I deserve to pay for what I've done." And so, Mr. Bright spent the rest of his days in prison, a broken man, serving a life sentence with no chance of redemption or forgiveness. On the other hand, Betty was filled with anger and sadness after Tony's death. She couldn't believe he had risked their family for an affair with Angela, and she couldn't help but blame him for not listening to her warnings. "If only he had listened to me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I knew something was off with him, but he always brushed me off." Betty struggled to make sense of her emotions. She was grieving the loss of her husband, but she was also struggling to come to terms with his betrayal. How could he do this to us? To our family? She asked, her voice breaking. Despite her pain and anger, Betty knew she had to find a way to move forward, but the weight of her loss and betrayal seemed almost too much to bear.